and he's with us now, Stephen K. Bannon. Steve, great to have you.
Hey, thanks for having me on, John. Appreciate it.
Steve, you've been the leading advocate now of holding the Chinese Communist Party accountable. One thing you said the other day on your radio show that really jolted me is you said you wanted to reject their sovereign immunity. How does that work?
Well, I think legislatively you can do it. You can do it simply. Actually, the White House can work with Congress to do it. Listen, here's the bottom line. You're seeing all the defenders of this regime in China, this dictatorial regime that really has put tremendous agony and pressure on the Chinese people. What happened in this pandemic? Forget whether it came out of their lab. Forget whether this is part of a bioweapon program that was illegal. Forget whether they were doing these tests on called change of function, which they shouldn't be doing. Let's put all that aside because that'll be investigated. It's already starting to be investigated by both intelligence agencies and medical professionals throughout the world. They knew, and we know they knew now, by late December of 2019, they had human-to-human transmission and community spread of a SARS-like virus in Hubei province in Wuhan by around Christmas, week of December. And the Taiwan, the Free Republic of China in Taiwan notified the World Health Organization on December 31st. Also, one of the guys I broadcast with into China did a broadcast on December 31st. This was known, this Dr. Li, who eventually died of coronavirus. He notified officials and others in Wuhan that had this coming into their hospitals. And a group of 8 young doctors started talking about it. Those guys Dr. Li was actually tortured and forced to sign a confession that he was rumor mongering. That happened around January 2nd or 3rd. The Chinese Communist Party in Beijing and the entire party apparatus knew that they had a beginning of an epidemic that would lead to a pandemic in late December of 2019 and early January. And they hid this. They never mentioned it when they came to the White House. They started operating. In fact, they misled the World Health Organization, who did a terrible job on this. World Health Organization put out a notice on January 12th and followed it up with a tweet that we have and we shared to the world that said on January 14th, after consultation, and this is on the main World Health Organization Twitter account, after consultation with senior medical officials of the Chinese Communist Party, they have told us there's no human-to-human transmission. That is a lie. They knew this at the time. At the same time, they were planning on shutting down, locking down Hubei province, quarantining Wuhan, restricting travel to the rest of China. They were getting ready to lock down, stop this massive migration they have once a year for Lunar New Year, the Chinese New Year. Those were plans Beijing already had it in place, yet not to stop international travel, including almost 350,000 to 400,000 Chinese, innocent Chinese who didn't know they had it, coming to the United States, okay, and many, many more going to Europe, of which they then came to JFK. This is 100% responsibility. They knew it. They had it so badly that they went around secretly and vacuumed up all the PPE, the personal protective equipment, in Europe, Australia, and the United States, both to have in case it exploded all over China, and number two, to use it as leverage, which they're doing throughout the world when this expanded to the entire world. No, the Chinese Communist Party, the record here is just, it's straightforward. And therefore, Southampton University did a study in England that showed that if they had been truthful on the last week of December, if they had just done what any government would have done, 95% of the deaths and 95% of the economic carnage would have been avoided. And John, I heard your march through Georgia that you're going to do next week. 55,000 Americans. This is the greatest mass casualty event in American history for civilians. 55,000 Americans are dead as of this morning, and quite frankly, there's no end in sight. We're at this plateau now of around 2,000 Americans a day. Every day, we have essentially an antietam, and this thing is kind of now it's supposed to drop off fairly dramatically, but we haven't seen that in the deaths so far. The deaths continue to be there, and quite frankly, the White House is. And Politico had a story. There's 60,000 casualty number on the low end, we're going to blow through essentially Vietnam by the press briefing this afternoon around 5 o'clock, and we'll blow through the 60,000, I think, before the kickoff to the May 1st reopenings of the country's going to start reopening this week. We'll be through the 60,000 deaths this week. That's all laid at the doorstep of the Chinese Communist Party. This bickering we have back and forth between mayors and governors and the president and the White House and all that to me is the noise, not the signal. It's the signal and the noise. The signal is it's the Chinese Communist Party is responsible, not the Chinese people, but the Chinese Communist Party is responsible for all the agony in the world, all the economic carnage in the world, and there are a number of methodologies we can do to go get the money back. Number one, we ought to be thinking about canceling their debt. Number two, we ought to strip them of sovereign immunity. There's a lawyer up in New York that wants to put the JASTA the same way that the victims of 9/11, after being settled by the insurance companies, are now, I think, have a $50 billion lawsuit against the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for the terrorist attacks in 9/11. We should go after the CCP for that. The American people, every casket and every coffin you see in that mass grave on Hart's Island in New York, and everybody ought to see that photograph. We have a mass grave with prisoners from Rikers Island digging it and just burying Americans, next to each other with no funeral service, no ceremony, just throwing them in an open pit. Okay, that's what your country's come to. Every one of those has a lawyer attached to it, and those lawyers should now get ready. The attorney generals of Missouri and other attorney generals, I think Mississippi announced over the weekend they're looking at it. They ought to go after the Chinese Communist Party, guns blazing, to get the money to get the compensation for this horrific event that they caused.
Stephen K. Bannon with us. Stephen K. Bannon, host of the hottest radio show in America, War Room Pandemic, heard 10 to noon across the John Fredericks Radio Network Monday to Saturday, is also on America's Voice.news, channel 219 if you have the dish, and then at Newsmax rerun at 11 p.m. Steve, let me ask a couple of questions, and let's start with the fact that Beijing did not allow travel. I mean, the CCP didn't allow travel to Beijing, but they allowed travel to the West, right? U.S., JFK,
Absolutely.
that's the reason
they limited
everybody's...
travel. They limited travel.
Why did they do that?
But they limited travel. And the two things they did in mid-January that they have blood on their hands is that they didn't tell the world about human-to-human transmission. In fact, they lied about it to the World Health Organization and to the United States, number one. Number two, they locked down China and didn't allow inter-province travel, particularly anything out of Hubei, but allowed Wuhan and Hubei to travel overseas. That's how the disease spread. It got to Milan because of China, and it got to here because the interim step, one directly from China. President Trump, remember, shut that down January 31st, but still coming through Europe. They locked down domestic travel but allowed it to go international, right? And then the third thing is they went around and swept up. Remember, the key parts of this when the virus first hits is the capacity constraint you have at the ICU units. And the biggest capacity constraints are not ventilators, and it's not beds, as tough and bad as that is. It is doctors and nurses and ventilator technicians. It's the humans. And the only way you protect them is PPE, is personal protective gear. Also, all the problems we have with testing. Remember, one of the biggest problems is personal protective gear for the doctors and nurses or the attendants that take this. They have to have protective gear on. The Chinese went around when they knew they had a problem. They went around to the world. They went around to Europe, the United States, and Australia, and swept all that up. When President Trump, remember, it shows you the statesmanship of President Trump and Secretary Pompeo and the goodness in the hearts of the American people. We offered the Chinese, certain personal protective equipment. Remember, we sent masks and things over. They never told us the depth of the problem. So these guys, listen, we're at war with those guys. Warfare today is both information and economic. They have engaged with a hot war, and I've said this for years, on an information/cyber and economic against the United States of America and the West to try to make us buckle and become part of their system. Okay, this has been going on for years. It's the reason Donald Trump's president of the United States is that managed to climb by our elites. And if you want to see the managed decline, look at Bill Gates' interview. Go to Daily Mail. It's the lead story. It's been all weekend. He did an interview, I think, with the Times of London, where he's taking the CCP side. He's saying, we don't have time right now to look at how this thing started. We don't have time right now. It's not a good time for us to look at whether they told the truth. We have to look at solutions, and they did some pretty good things. Listen, I do believe they did some smart things. They knew they had a problem. They shut down Wuhan the way I would have shut down the United States to try to crash the virus, not try to slow it, try to crash it. So you get in quick and hard, and you get out quick and hard. And I think they did that in a smart way. That's actually a model that I think is a better model than the way we did it. But, we're a democracy, and we have individual rights, and we're a much different system. But however, that's got to be put aside. The central part that Gates and these guys want us, all the globalists and all the people in bed with them, and we're going to find out over time the Gates Foundation's association with World Health and their associations with the P2 and the P4 lab in Wuhan. And I think people are going to be quite shocked about the involvement of, quite frankly, the United States of funding some of this research, right, over at NIH and also World Health Organization with our money funding certain things. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt, and this has been reported in State Department cables by the Washington Post, which is not exactly a pro-Trump site, that there were a number of signals for years of State Department officials in China that were concerned about this P4 lab, about the complete incompetence in its management and the risky type of experiments they were doing. This is equivalent. If you want to see what went on in that lab in Wuhan, just go to HBO and watch the series on Chernobyl. This was a biological Chernobyl of people who didn't know what they were, not totally professionally trained, doing risky things. Just like in Chernobyl, they did those experiments on the reactor, that you didn't have a qualified crew, and they screwed it up. And from that time forward, the regime just tried to cover it up, and they didn't care what happened to the people in Chernobyl, the people in the Ukraine, or the people in the world. It's the exact same analogy here. Incompetent people doing risky things, not supervised, and once things get out of control, they lie about it. And that's exactly what you have here. And today, the American people have a perfect example of Bill Gates, one of these globalists, right, who says the big problem, Gates points to he says the big problem in this thing is nationalism. The big problem is Italy and the United States, all these populists and these nationalists, the two nationalists. That's the big problem. He identifies the problem of this as nationalism, but don't say anything about the Chinese Communist Party. Don't say anything about the guys in Beijing. This is the hypocrisy and greed and malevolence of the American elites, personified by the tech community as personified by Bill Gates.
Why is the elite left in the United States protecting the Chinese?
Because they make more money with them. The business model works. Slave labor in China, right, and make people here, the working class here, serfs. It's a business model that works. Mm-hmm. It's worked for 15 or 20 years. That's why the jobs all shifted over to China. Mm-hmm. All the manufacturing, the managed decline of America is because our elites made more money. Mm-hmm. They like the China model. Mm-hmm. They don't care about the Chinese people. Remember, the Chinese people are actually the biggest victims here. They're the most decent, hardworking people on earth. They're essentially slave labor, right? They were forced to go back to these factories at the tip of, but essentially the tip of bayonets to open the factories back up.
Right.
When they could have a second wave. You don't get a vote in China. People should keep in mind, of the 1.4 billion people in China, only 90 million are associated with the Communist Party members. Mm-hmm. And of that, only a couple thousand make a difference. One of the biggest things we're going to start to reveal over the next couple of weeks is the wealth, the enormous wealth of individuals in the Chinese Communist Party, and how much of that wealth is in the United States. They own billions of dollars of real estate in the United States.
So what if we just seize it?
They have billions of dollars of securities here.
Can we just seize it?
Individuals that run the Chinese Communist Party.
Can we just seize it?
Absolutely. You can seize their assets.
So I think you're onto something.
We should stop all the companies from trading here. We should seize their assets. We should seize. That's how you got to strip the sovereign immunity from them. But this is going to be, and politicians that defend this are going to be in the losing side of this argument. Okay? The American people have righteous indignation right now about what happened. This is at the doorstep of the Chinese Communist Party. This was brought on by our elites, kowtowing to them and allowing them to operate like they've operated for the last 10, 15 years. And now it's come home to roost, and the people that bore the brunt on this are the American people, and particularly working-class people in these big cities. We have 55,000 dead. Who knows how many we're going to end up with? Trillions of dollars of economic carnage and economic crisis that triggered a financial crisis that's far greater than 2008. The president's former Council of Economic Advisors, Kevin Hassett, is one of the smartest guys. He's volunteered as a patriot to go back in the White House, volunteer to work every day during this crisis. He's on George Stephanopoulos yesterday. I think he says we're going to have unemployment at the scale of the Great Depression.
Yeah.
None of this have to happen. Remember, and we'll put it back up today, and we'll discuss it today on the show, the Southampton University study in England says that 95% of all of this would not have happened if in late September they would have done with the common decency of any human being, say, hey, nothing to be ashamed of, but we have a SARS outbreak. We have a SARS outbreak, and here's what we have to do with it. Here's why they lied about it. It's not because it's a wet market. If it was truly a wet market, they would have come clean. The reason they lied about it, there's something about that P2 lab, there's the Chinese CDC P2 lab in Wuhan, and the P4, the really dangerous one, the P4 lab. The reason they hid it, the reason they lied about it, is they didn't want anybody, and they still haven't given us, by the way, today we don't really know if we have, and in fact most scientists say, we don't know if we have the original genome, if they've given us the real genetic structure of this virus. This is why this virus is mutating all over the world. Look at the different way people die. They have a thing in the Washington Post the other day. People in the 20s and 30s die by a stroke. This thing has 30 mutations already. This is why I keep saying, don't sit in fantasy land and think you're going to have a vaccine anytime soon. Mm-hmm. You should assume, and every official has to assume, we're never going to have a vaccine. We might. That would be great. The earliest we're going to get it's a year and a half or 2 years from now. You can't plan on having a vaccine. You can have therapeutics, and there's 100 different alternatives that people are looking at right now, including advanced research on what the president was saying the other day about the UV light. There's advanced research, but he wasn't as articulate as he normally is in describing that. But they're long range, out years research being done on those things right now, as they should be. You should be looking at every alternative on therapeutics, just like we've managed the AIDS epidemic. HIV, there's no vaccine for HIV, but there's a cocktail of therapeutics that manages that. That's what the CCP virus or COVID-19 is probably going to be. But the point is, it's their responsibility. The president said a week ago, knowingly responsible, and that doesn't mean it came from the lab. That doesn't mean it was a bioweapons program. Knowingly responsible means they knew about it, they lied about it. If they'd come clean, you wouldn't be sitting in your apartment today with no job, no pension fund, no future, no baseball, no football, and John Fredericks having to schlep down to Atlanta to get a haircut.
Now, it's sad, right? Steve, let's get to politics.
No, it's not sad. It's not sad. This is an outrage.
It's outrage.
This is what the mainstream media and the Chinese Communist Party is doing. No, the mainstream media all night long, if they mention China at all, it's in a 2-minute segment.
Right.
This should be all night. We shouldn't be at each other's throats. You shouldn't have to have people protesting, opening up. It ought to be some process we agree upon. But there's no need to turn on each other. Whether you're a right-wing conservative Tea Party guy, gun owner, or some left-wing progressive, the whole focus ought to be who started this. And who started this is the Chinese Communist Party. The biggest victims are the people in Wuhan, the good, decent citizens there, who, by the way, they died in the hundreds of thousands. They've lied from day one about how many people got infected here and how many people died. It's the Chinese are the biggest victims. Remember, it's their freedom that's going to drive this entire narrative, because I got to tell you, I think they've had a belly full of it, and you're going to start to see the pressure build.
Steve, let's get to politics. I got a couple more minutes. Joe Biden, how does he fit in this whole thing?
Well, listen, at the time of President Trump came out with the historic stop the air traffic from China on January 31st, plus quarantine people, right? Biden chose, when Biden had a choice, a decision, what did he do? He chose the side of Beijing. He took the party line and mouthed the exact thing Beijing was saying about Trump. He's a nativist, he's a racist, he's a xenophobe. That, to me, in a time of crisis, which actually Trump became a wartime president, is disqualifying. If you go back and look at Obama knew we had to pivot to Asia, Middle East. He had this thing called the pivot to Asia. He deputized Biden to go put that into action. He was an abject failure. He kowtowed to the Chinese Communist Party. He was hoodwinked. The reason they've militarized the South China Sea, the reason there are more cyber attacks, the reason there's more economic warfare, the reason that they're on the offense and we're on the defense is Joe Biden failed when he was deputized by Barack Obama to take care of the problem. Right. In addition, he allowed his son, his deadbeat drug addict son, let me repeat that, his deadbeat drug addict son, to basically raise $1.5 billion of capital from the Chinese Communist Party's bank, the Bank of China, start a hedge fund that then invested in surveillance technology to enslave the Chinese people, to build the firewall and to build this digital police state. That's the Biden family. Joe Biden's got blood on his hands, okay, just like the Chinese Communist Party. He's a business partner. He's been co-opted by the Chinese Communist Party. If that's what the Democrats want to run in the fall, God bless them. Run it. And they can take out all the spots about President Trump saying this about Xi. Take them all out. It's not going to matter. The people in the upper Midwest, when pressed with the facts, are going to understand Joe Biden's a globalist. Joe Biden has always taken the CCP party line. He's always backed the regime in Beijing. And we have a whole series of stuff we're going to reveal on Joe Biden about his relationship with Xi. Okay? He's up to his neck with the Chinese Communist Party. He is on the side of the enemy of the Chinese people, the American people, and all mankind. So if that's what they want to run, then God bless them. Put them up, and let's see what happens.
Steve Bannon, last question. What's the objective now of the DNC, the Democratic Party? Another $700 billion. They want bailout state governments. Plus, to do that, they want new rules to vote by mail. They don't want anything open, right? You look at what they're doing in Michigan. All the swing states with Democratic governors, they want the economy to continue to tank. What's their objective here, Steve?
Well, listen, look, you're in a time of crisis. I got to tell you, I just think the fourth package is going to be, I don't want to say politicized, but I think people are saying, hey, we really got to think about the balance sheet of the United States, right? We can't. I keep teasing every day that we're the United States of the Federal Reserve. This massive cash infusion off the balance sheet is basically it's the full faith and credit of the United States. If that gets back, it's on the shoulders of the deplorables. And so I think this has to be gone through in a very, very detailed way. I don't believe there's going to be a $2 infrastructure plan. I know the president wants that. The Democrats aren't going to give that to him. I think right now there's got to be very focused on the opening of the economy in a smart way so this thing doesn't blow back on us. We don't want that to happen. These governors got to work in unison. I think the president's you're going to see he's going to start taking additional leadership, and I think particularly in the messaging of the economic part of this, which is moving to kind of that phase. So I would stand by. The country has to come together. This is a crisis. It's a war. We have to come together.
With me, though,
that put our marginal differences aside to pull together.
You would agree with me, though, that right now the messaging coming out of the White House is worse than I've ever seen it. It's garbled. It's mixed. You never know from one day to the other what they're talking about. Trump says one thing. Fauci says something else. Pence says another thing. Dr. Birx runs over to NBC, disputes that. I mean, the messaging coming out of that place and those press conferences are horrific. How are you going to change that?
I think it's number one. I think it's action. I've advocated for a long time. Bifurcate that group into an economic working group, into the medical and the pandemic, which Vice President Trump's on. I think now it's action, action, action. Your messaging is your action. We're now into the game that look. We've through preseason. We're going to get now to start opening up the economy.
Right.
This has got to be done very smartly in a tough, focused, data-driven, science-backed way. We know this concept the vice president has of mass on point. That's mass therapeutics, mass surveillance, tracking, testing, and also this antibodies testing. We got to bring all three of those together. We got to open this up smartly and toughly, in a tough way, and just get on with it. I think the messaging follows the actions. The key is get the action plan set, execute on the action plan. The messaging will take care of itself.
Final question. I'm going to Georgia. Do you think Governor Brian Kemp did the right thing?
Here's what I think. I think the president basically devolved this back to the governors in this federalist move. I didn't totally agree with it, but he made that decision. The governors locked these states down over time under his guidance. He gave guidance overall to unlock them. Governor Kemp, I think, has a plan of how to do it. Governor Kemp knows Georgia, I think, better than we do. He knows the aspects of it. I think he's a very focused guy. He's I think, got a lot of gravitas. We'll have to see. The guys I would watch are Mike DeWine in Ohio and Abbott in Texas. Mm-hmm. I think they did a very prudent thing of how they took their states, offline, and I think they're very prudent. I'm not saying Kemp didn't, but Kemp was a little late to the party. I think Abbott and DeWine will drive the narrative because I think their actions and how they come back, they're prudent guys. They know about risk mitigation. They're tough, hard-bitten politicians. Abbott's clearly going to be a guy that people look at in 2024. Those guys, I think that they will start to drive the narrative that the rest of these Democratic governors will have to catch up with. So I would tell people, look, Kemp is a kind of an experiment, right? But the ones to really watch are DeWine in Ohio, Abbott in Texas. Let's see how they bring their states back online. And remember, this is not going to be perfect. And we can't be snarky about everything being perfect. This is going to be a very complicated process. People have to pull together. The enemy is not your fellow citizens. The enemy is not a progressive Democrat and not a right-wing conservative Republican. The enemy is the Chinese Communist Party. They're at war with us. They did this to us. We have to smartly and in a tough way, in a focused way, in a tough-minded way, bring the country back together, bring the country out of this shutdown, and then focus on what the reality is. We have a totalitarian dictatorship that is focused on destroying us. And people better wake up to that and particularly start to hold the Bill Gateses and their other fellow travelers to account about what the elites have done to this country.
Steve Bannon, we're out of time. I want to thank Steve Bannon for being with us. You can catch him, War Room Pandemic, 10 to noon, Monday to Saturday, John Fredericks Radio Network.